When a broken soldier follows his dog into the mountains, they uncover something no one's seen for 100 years. A lost steam locomotive sealed in darkness, hiding a secret worth far more than gold. Like and subscribe if you believe the past still breathes beneath our feet. He came home, but not all of him did. Jack Hollis had spent half his life building engines meant to survive hell, and the other half trying to forget what those engines carried. The war had left him with a limp that ached when the snow came, a silence that followed him into every room, and a stare that never seemed to rest on the present. His home sat at the edge of Leadville, Colorado, tucked between black pines and wind. It wasn't much, just a cabin. He'd built himself one room for sleeping, one for tools, and a porch that creaked like old bones. Some nights he'd sit there with a can of beer that went warm before he finished it, but the silence never lasted long because Bear was always there. Bear was a German shepherd big as a bear cub when Jack first met him in Kandahar, all teeth and loyalty. They'd both been soldiers, then Bear trained to sniff out explosives, Jack to fix the machines that carried men to their deaths. They'd saved each other once under a sky the color of ash when an IED turned their convoy into fire. Jack had carried the dog out, burned hands shaking, and Bear had refused to leave his side after that day. When the Army retired the animal, Jack signed every paper to bring him home. That was 8 years ago. Now they were two old veterans sharing the same scarred silence. Winter in Leadville came hard, wrapping the mountains in ice and memory. The locals knew Jack as the quiet mechanic. He fixed things no one else had patience for: old farm trucks, broken chainsaws, once even a rusted generator that hadn't run since the 70s. He never charged full price. He never talked about the war. He never smiled when someone said thank you. But Bear seemed to carry the warmth for both of them. Kids from the town would leave scraps by the fence for him. When Jack wasn't looking, Bear would wag his tail gentle as an old man greeting ghosts. Some nights, Jack dreamt he was back in the desert. The sand turned white, the wind howled like artillery, and he woke with sweat cold on his neck. Bear would already be sitting there, muzzle pressed to his knee-eye, saying what words couldn't. "You're still here." That night, the one that changed everything began like any other. Wind howled through the trees. The heater clicked off with a cough. Jack rubbed his leg, watching the flames gutter in the stove. Bear was pacing near the door, tail stiff, ears alert. Then came the bark, sharp, urgent, a sound Jack hadn't heard since the front lines. "What is it, boy?" Bear growled low, head tilted toward the woods. Jack grabbed his coat and flashlight. The snow outside was a wall of white, each flake flashing in the beam like sparks. Bear led the way, nose down, muscles coiled. Jack followed the paw prints, breath fogging in the cold. Halfway down the slope, something glinted between the trees, metal buried deep under snow. At first he thought it was debris from an old snowplow, but then the light caught it, a rusted rail, thick and ancient, running straight into the mountain. His chest tightened. He hadn't seen tracks like that in decades. The beam of the flashlight followed the line until it disappeared beneath a ridge. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered. Bear pawed at the ground, whining. Jack crouched beside him, brushing away the snow. Letters appeared on a half-buried sign: Silver, Elk, Mine, Est, 1891. Closed, 1894. Avalanche, disaster. The words looked carved in ice. Jack stood there for a long minute listening. The wind had stopped. Only the sound of his own heartbeat and Bear's soft breathing filled the dark. Something about it felt wrong, too. Still too expectant, like the mountain itself was holding its breath. "Come on, boy," he murmured. "We'll come back tomorrow." But as he turned away, the beam of light caught something else scratched into the metal plate at the base of the sign, nearly erased by rust. A single word. Croft. He didn't know why the name felt familiar, but it lodged in his mind like a splinter. When they reached the cabin again, Jack shut the door, turned up the heater, and sat beside Bear on the floor. "You ever get the feeling," he said quietly, "that something's waiting for you?" Bear tilted his head, then rested his muzzle on Jack's thigh. The fire crackled, and for a moment the old soldier allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, coming home still meant something. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the tracks they'd left behind, hiding the path that would lead them to everything they didn't know they were looking for. Morning came pale and brittle, the kind of cold that cracks wood and makes breath sting. Jack hadn't slept much. The image of that rusted rail and the name Croft had played through his mind all night like a half-forgotten song. He poured himself coffee gone bitter from the stove-fed Bear a piece of jerky and stood by the window watching the fog crawl up from the valley. "All right, partner," he murmured, pulling on his coat. "Let's see what you found." Bear wagged his tail once already at the door before Jack finished the sentence. The snow had crusted over from the night before, the kind that held a man's weight for a few steps before giving way. Bear moved ahead, sure-footed his paws leaving prints that pointed like arrows toward the ridge. Jack followed the familiar trail until the trees opened up and the clearing appeared again. The sign was still there, its letters glinting faintly under a thin film of frost. He brushed the snow from it with his glove, reading aloud almost to himself. Silver Elk Mining Company, established 1891. Closed 1894. Avalanche disaster. His voice echoed softly through the stillness swallowed by the mountain. He crouched down, running his fingers over the corroded bolts. The metal was brittle, the kind made in the late 19th century, thick and hand-forged. Bear circled around the sign, sniffing every inch of the ground. "There's nothing here but ghosts," Jack muttered, though even as he said it, he knew that wasn't true. He knew how things objects places could hold on to pieces of people. The rails extended a few feet before vanishing into earth and snow. Jack crouched and followed their line with his eyes. They ran straight into a ridge that looked unnaturally smooth, like it had been carved and then swallowed by time. Bear's paws stopped there. He sniffed the frozen ground, then began to dig fast and focused snow flying in all directions. "Easy, Bear," Jack said, kneeling beside him. He helped clear the top layer until his glove struck something solid. The hollow thud of metal rang through the quiet morning. He brushed away the ice, revealing a small rectangular plate tarnished green. The letters came slowly into focus. A. Croft Foreman. 1893. The name again. Jack frowned. Croft? He whispered more to the wind than to Bear. He remembered seeing that name etched at the bottom of the sign last night. 2 mentions in 2 places buried nearly a century deep. He turned the plate in his hand, the weight of it heavier than its size. Bear let out a low whine and started digging again just beside where the plate had been buried. Snow gave way to frozen dirt, then to timber. Old support beams snapped clean from what looked like an entrance once boarded up. Jack leaned closer. Through the cracks he could see darkness that swallowed the light whole. The air leaking from it smelled faintly of rust and stone. He crouched low, brushing the dirt away carefully. The frame of the entrance was still there. 2 vertical beams and a crossbar on top, all gray and splintered. The rails disappeared into the hole, a tunnel sealed by a century of collapse. He reached out, touching the wood. It felt cold, but intact. Bear barked once, sharp and short, then stepped back tail down, but eyes locked on the opening. "You smell something?" Jack asked softly. Bear didn't move. He just stood there steady and tense, the fur along his spine slightly raised. Jack pushed aside more debris with his gloved hand, revealing the faint curve of the tunnel mouth. He couldn't see far inside, just enough to catch the shadowed glint of what might be steel or maybe ice. He felt a strange pull, a quiet hum that rose from the ground beneath his boots. It wasn't sound. It was memory, a vibration older than language. He found himself whispering, "What did you hide here, Croft?" The wind picked up suddenly, swirling through the clearing. The sound it made against the old sign was like a whisper, long and drawn out, echoing through the trees. Jack stood slowly, the brass plate still in his hand. The name, pressed against his palm, left a faint impression. He slipped it into his pocket, then turned toward Bear. The dog had moved a few feet away, staring at something half buried in the snow beyond the entrance, a mound too symmetrical to be natural. Jack walked over and nudged it with his boot. Underneath, the frost wooden planks crossed over each other, forming a crude barrier. He brushed more snow aside, revealing iron nails driven deep, blackened with age. A warning or a door. The air was different here, colder, yes, but also alive, moving in slow breaths through cracks between the boards. When Jack leaned closer, he thought he heard something faint, like water dripping or maybe metal shifting far inside the mountain. Bear growled low, the sound rumbling deep in his chest. "Yeah," Jack said quietly. "I hear it too." He rose to his full height, staring into the ridge where the rails vanished. The soldier in him, the one who'd spent years diffusing machines meant to kill, recognized that stillness, the pause before something awakens. Whatever lay behind that wooden barrier hadn't been meant to stay hidden forever. He looked once more at Bear, then at the snow-dusted sign. The wind calmed, and the silence that followed felt almost like an answer. Jack exhaled a thin stream of mist, leaving his lips. "Tomorrow," he said under his breath. "We dig tomorrow." Bear wagged his tail once, as if in agreement, and together they turned back toward the cabin. Behind them, the mountain stood still, the rails glinting faintly beneath the snow, marking a path into the dark that was waiting to be found again. Night returned like a tide of cold air rolling down from the peaks, wrapping the valley in silence. Jack hadn't spoken to anyone all day. The brass plate sat on his workbench, cleaned of dirt and oxidation, the name A. Croft, now gleaming faintly under the lantern light. Every time he looked at it, something inside him stirred a sense that this man, whoever he'd been, had left more than his name in that mountain. When dusk fell, Jack packed a small kit, his headlamp a crowbar, a compact shovel a coil of rope, and a portable winch salvaged from an old Jeep engine. Bear stood by the doortail, still watching him. "I know," Jack said softly. "You can feel it too." By the time they reached the ridge, the moon had risen, casting the forest in pale silver. The clearing looked untouched except for the faint marks from yesterday's digging, now frozen solid. The air was colder, heavier. Jack set up the lantern beside the half-buried entrance and began prying loose the boards covering the tunnel mouth. The first plank broke with a muted crack, the second splintered clean. With every nail he pulled, a faint current of air leaked out, cold, stale, almost human in the way it seemed to exhale. When the last beam gave way, a deep hollow sigh came from within the earth, carrying the scent of rust-damp soil and age. Bear's ears twitched. He took a step back, nose lifted, tasting the air. "Smells like time itself," Jack muttered. He crouched and aimed his flashlight into the darkness. The beam stretched forward, swallowed quickly by distance, but what it revealed in the near distance made his breath catch. The tunnel was still intact, timber supports lined to the walls, blackened but unbroken. The rails ran straight and true, disappearing into shadow. He expected collapse ruin, but instead it looked like a world simply paused, waiting. Jack tested the ground with his boot. Solid. He attached the rope to a nearby tree, tied it around his waist, and stepped in. The air changed instantly, thick with dust and cold. His footsteps echoed faintly, mixing with the soft click of Bear's claws behind him. Light revealed details, old pickaxes leaning against the wall, and a helmet overturned in the dirt. Jack picked it up, brushing away the grime. Inside lay a spoon, tarnished and still marked with initials scratched by hand. EC, he set it down gently. Everything felt too preserved, as if time had been afraid to move here. "Someone closed this up on purpose," he murmured. Bear gave a low growl, not of fear, but awareness. The tunnel curved slightly, and as they rounded it, the air grew colder. Frost had formed along the lower beams, shimmering like glass in the beam of the flashlight. Every few steps, Jack tapped the timbers with his crowbar, listening to the echo. Each sound came back steady, no sign of collapse. The silence between taps, though, was deep enough to hear his own heartbeat. Somewhere ahead, a drop of water fell the sound, crisp and impossibly loud. Then Bear stopped. His body went rigid, head angled towards the darkness ahead. A sharp rattle escaped his throat, a sound halfway between a growl and a warning. "What is it?" Jack whispered, lowering the light. Bear took one step forward, then froze completely, his gaze locked straight ahead. Jack followed it, raising the flashlight beam. The light hit something massive and reflective, hidden beneath a sheet of dust and debris. At first, he thought it was part of the tunnel wall, but the shape was wrong, too symmetrical, too deliberate. He moved closer, sweeping away the loose rock with his boot. The outline of a great cylinder emerged, flanked by metal rods and wheels, half buried in silt. A faint trace of brass gleamed near the base. Jack's breath fogged in the beam. He stepped closer, running his glove over the cold surface. The dust came off in streaks, revealing riveted steel beneath. "No way," he whispered. The letters stamped into the side were faint but legible under his trembling light. Lima Locomotive Works. A Shay engine built for steep grades and mining rail. He remembered reading about them once in an old engineering manual. A whole engine, he said almost to himself. How did they get you in here? The sheer size of it defied reason. The tunnel wasn't wide enough to have rolled the thing in after completion, which meant it had been entombed here during operation. Bear barked once, short and sharp, as if answering a question Jack hadn't yet asked. Jack stepped back, raising the light to reveal the rest of the machine boiler wheels and the remnants of the cab crushed slightly under fallen stone. The brass fixtures had dulled to the color of old bone, but even through decay the craftsmanship was clear. The thing was beautiful in its ruin. He placed his hand flat on the boiler, feeling the faint chill seeping through his glove. "You've been waiting down here a long time," he said quietly. The air didn't move yet. He swore the mountain breathed with him, a slow, steady rhythm rising from the earth itself. For a long time neither man nor dog moved. They stood there in the half-light, surrounded by relics of men who'd dug too deep and dreamed too hard. Jack stood motionless in the half-dark chamber, his breath visible in the frozen air. The beam from his headlamp trembled slightly as he reached out, brushing another layer of dust and rock off the massive machine. The soot clung to his gloves, black and gritty, but beneath it the steel gleamed faintly like a sleeping giant's skin. "Lima Locomotive Works," he whispered, reading the raised letters on the side. Below it, another line appeared as he wiped harder. "Class B, Shay No. 42. His voice echoed the words, bouncing down the tunnel and returning to him hollow and distant. A Shay engine, built for mountain mining railways. He hadn't seen one outside of a museum catalog, and certainly never entombed like this. Bear sniffed the ground nearby, circling the perimeter, his nails clicking against the old rail. Every step stirred small clouds of dust that hung in the flashlight's beam like golden smoke. "You see this, boy?" Jack murmured. "This thing shouldn't even fit down here." He ran his hand along the rivets following the curved boiler until his fingers found a patch smoother than the rest. He scraped at it with his knife, and a faint engraving came into focus, handmade, not factory-stamped. "Silver Elk, December 1893. For my son." Jack froze the knife still in his hand. His heart gave a slow, heavy thud. He whispered the words again, tracing them with his fingertip. "For my son." Whoever had left that message hadn't been an engineer making notes. It had been a man. Maybe the foreman Croft, maybe someone else. A father leaving his mark in steel, a promise Jack said under his breath. Or maybe a goodbye. Bear stopped circling and sat down, watching him closely, head tilted. The air felt charged like the space between lightning and thunder. Jack's light swept across the ground around the locomotive. The steel wheels sat on rails still intact, though warped with age. Debris from a ceiling collapse covered part of the rear section, burying what had once been the cab. He crouched, running the beam beneath the frame. Grease fittings, drive shafts, even a broken coupling rod, all there, all impossibly well preserved. It was as if someone had parked it, sealed the tunnel, and walked away forever. He found a toolbox near the wheels, its lid half open, filled with rusted wrenches, a hammer, and a set of bolts wrapped neatly in cloth. Not abandoned in haste, left in order. Bear's claws clicked softly behind him again. The dog had wandered to a corner where loose rocks formed a small mound. He was pawing at it with purpose, nose deep in the dirt. "What did you find now?" Jack asked, standing and walking over. Bear stopped tail flicking. Beneath his paws, a piece of metal glinted faintly. Jack crouched beside him, pushing aside the stones. It was a small rectangular box, its edges rounded from age. He pried it free, dusting it off. The lid came loose easily, and inside was a piece of machinery no bigger than a hand wrapped carefully in oilcloth. He unwrapped it slowly. The cloth crumbled at the edges, dry but still faintly oily. Inside lay a broken gear assembly, its teeth snapped clean in one place. Jack turned it in the light. "A drive gear," he said quietly. "Off the engine, maybe, but why wrap and keep it? It looked worn, yes, but not worthless." As he rotated it, he noticed a small tag wired to the shaft, handwritten on brittle parchment. The ink had bled, but 2 words were still legible: his hands. Jack frowned, lips pressed tight. Whoever had placed it there had known what they were doing. Someone had preserved it deliberately, as if saving a fragment of themselves. He placed the gear back in its box, then glanced at the engine again. "Someone meant for this to be found," he said softly. His voice echoed again, swallowed by the stone walls. Bear whined low, pressing his nose against Jack's sleeve. Jack rested a hand on the dog's head absently. His mind raced. Who was Croft? The name had appeared twice now, carved and stamped, echoing through decades of dust. He took a step back, raising his light toward the top of the engine. The cab roof was crushed inward, splintered wood still clinging to its supports. He climbed up carefully, his boots scraping on the corroded steel until he could peer inside. The seat was still there, the control levers frozen mid-motion. A faded jacket hung from a rusted hook, blue canvas torn but whole. He reached toward it, but stopped himself. Some part of him felt it would be wrong to move anything. Instead, he just stood there, surrounded by the quiet hum of the mountain. For a heartbeat, he could almost hear the faint rhythm of engines long dead. He closed his eyes. It was as if the mountain was breathing again, slow and deep. Bear barked once, sharp enough to startle him. Jack looked down. The dog was standing at the tunnel's edge, body stiff, eyes fixed on something behind him. The flashlight beam swung with his movement, scattering shadows across the steel hull. Something had shifted. A sound, faint metallic, came from within the debris pile behind the locomotive. Jack froze, every sense alert. The air had changed again, heavier, alive. He stared into the darkness beyond the wreck, the beam trembling in his hand, waiting for the mountain to speak its next secret. Jack returned to the mountain every day after that night, carrying tools, notebooks, and questions that refused to quiet. The mine became his world, a place where time had collapsed into layers of metal and memory. Each morning, frost glittered on the old rails, and Bear waited by the cabin door, tail wagging faintly, as if reminding Jack of the promise they had made without words. Together, they descended into the heart of the mountain lantern light, cutting through the damp air. Jack's breath echoed off the stone, mingling with the distant drip of water. He worked methodically. Bolts gave way with reluctant groans, steel parts coming loose after decades of silence. Every screw, every hinge, every plate told a story of precision and pride. The deeper he went into the engine's anatomy, the more it puzzled him. There were no signs of panic or abandonment. Whoever had left this machine here had done so deliberately. The boiler had been drained clean before being sealed, the firebox cleared of ash, the valves closed with care. Jack found the main coupling rod still greased, now hardened like amber. "No one leaves this kind of value behind," he muttered, his voice thin in the cold. "Not unless they had a reason." Bear sat nearby, eyes following his every move. Sometimes he would lie down with his head on his paws, ears twitching at the sound of metal scraping metal. Jack had long since started talking to him as if he were another mechanic on the job. If this was an accident, he said one afternoon, wiping his hands on a rag, they'd have come back for it. But no one did. Not in over 100 years. He ran his flashlight along the engine's length. So what did they hide? The dog gave a quiet grunt as if in agreement. Jack opened every compartment he could reach, the coal bin empty, the tender tank dry and rusted through the firebox, nothing but brittle brick and soot. The engineer's toolbox was still latched shut under the frame. Inside were a few rusted wrenches, a small oil can, and a folded rag so carefully placed that Jack hesitated before touching it. He unwrapped it slowly. The cloth disintegrated in his hands, leaving behind a single brass tag with numbers engraved 42B, the same as the locomotive's serial mark. He turned it over, blank on the other side. "Someone cataloged this," he said quietly, almost to himself. Someone meant to remember it. He placed it back exactly where it had been closing the box with a gentle click. Over the next 2 days, he mapped the chamber in chalk, sketching every bolt and marking every cavity. He used the small winch to pull debris from the crushed section, slowly clearing access to the upper portion of the cab. His hands grew raw. His shoulders ached, but he kept at it. Every discovery only deepened the mystery. If Croft was the foreman. Jack said to Bear as they paused for lunch near the entrance, maybe this wasn't about silver or money. Maybe it was about keeping something safe. Bear tilted his head-tail, flicking once. Then he stood suddenly, ears sharp, and began trotting back toward the engine. Jack frowned. "What is it?" The dog stopped beneath the boiler, pawing lightly at the side, then looking up toward the roof. He did it again, pawing, stopping, then barking, once short and pointed. Jack followed his gaze. There, near the top of the boiler, was a round dome-shaped structure covered in decades of grime. He'd barely noticed it before among the maze of pipes and fittings. "Easy, Bear," he said, moving closer. He set the ladder against the frame and climbed carefully, boots scraping on the steel. The dome's surface was layered with soot almost indistinguishable from the rest of the boiler. He brushed it clean with his glove. A line of faint letters began to emerge beneath his touch. He leaned closer, squinting under the beam of his headlamp. The inscription read "Sand Dome." Jack exhaled the fog of his breath spreading across the cold metal. He knew what that meant. The dome was used to hold sand dry and fine to spread over the rails when traction was poor. It was never part of the pressure system, which meant it stayed relatively sealed and dry but not pressurized, making it safe to open. "You clever old ghosts," he whispered. He ran his hand along the bolts, sealing the hatch. They were still intact, rusted but strong. If someone wanted to hide something, this would have been the perfect place. The sand dome sat above the boiler, heated enough to stay dry year-round, protected from moisture, sealed from time. A secret, hidden in plain sight. He looked down at Bear, who sat now with his head tilted watching. "You might be onto something, boy." The dog barked once softly, as if confirming what Jack already felt, the sense that the mountain had just given them a direction, the faintest breath of a trail, leading deeper into the truth buried within the steel. Jack stood beneath the towering frame of the old locomotive, his flashlight trembling against the curved steel as he studied the faded letters once more. Sand Dome. His breath fogged the metal. He could feel the weight of a century pressing through it, something secret lingering just beyond reach. "Dry, sealed, no pressure," he murmured, running a hand along the bolts. Perfect. The thought wasn't excitement, it was recognition. Whoever built this had known exactly what they were doing. The dome sat high above the main boiler, far enough from the heat to stay safe, close enough for maintenance, and most importantly kept the sand bone dry in a tightly sealed, non-pressurized space, a natural vault for hiding things. Bear waited below, shifting from paw to paw, his amber eyes following every move. The mine was silent except for the distant drip of condensation. Jack reached for his crowbar and hammer, looping the strap of his flashlight around his neck. "All right, boy," he said, voice low. "Let's see what's been hiding in here all these years." The first strike rang sharp metal against metal, echoing down the tunnel like the toll of a long-forgotten bell. Rust flaked off in red dust, swirling in the air like smoke. Bear barked once, the sound ricocheting off the stone walls. Jack smiled faintly. Sweat forming beneath his hat despite the cold. The bolts were old, fused by corrosion, but each one gave way a little under steady rhythm. Hammer, pause, pry, breathe. Time slipped away, reduced to sound and motion. The clang of steel, the grind of leverage, the occasional gust of stale air. With every bolt that loosened, he felt the past creak open by inches. After nearly an hour, his arms ached, shoulders burning, but the last clamp finally surrendered with a dry, metallic groan. The dome's lid shifted a fraction, sealed so tightly that the release of trapped air made a faint hiss, like the exhale of something ancient. Jack froze, hand resting on the edge. "You hear that?" Bear the dog gave a soft whine, ears twitching. The silence that followed felt alive, waiting. Slowly, Jack lifted the lid. It moved reluctantly, a scrape of rust and age. When it finally swung open, a soft plume of dust rose from within, carrying with it the scent of heatless sand and iron. He shone his flashlight into the hollow. At first, disappointment hit him. The dome was filled with sand, fine pale gold, untouched. He let out a breath that fogged the beam. Just sand, he said half to himself. But curiosity, that old soldier's stubbornness, kept his hand moving. He reached in, scooping a handful. The grains were bone-dry, slipping through his fingers like time itself. He sifted deeper arm, disappearing past the elbow, the coolness of the sand numbing his skin. Something solid brushed his fingertips. Not stone, not rust, something cold and flat. He froze, heartbeat quickening. Slowly, he brushed away more sand, the surface giving under his hand until the shape revealed itself a corner of metal, smooth and deliberate. "There's something in here," he whispered, pulse thudding in his ears. Bear barked once, sharp and excited tail wagging now. Jack set the flashlight between his teeth and began scooping faster sand, pouring down the sides of the dome in little avalanches. The more he cleared, the clearer it became, a small steel box, edges welded shut heavy even before he touched it. He grasped both sides and lifted. The weight surprised him, solid, dense rowel. He set it down carefully on the engine's deck. The beam of his flashlight glinted off a dull surface, marred by scratches. Words. He leaned closer, wiping away the last of the sand. Etched roughly into the metal with strokes uneven but deliberate were the words Silver Elk. January 1894, A. Croft. The same name that had haunted every discovery the same year, carved into rusted plates and buried signs. Croft. Jack whispered, fingers tracing the letters. "What did you leave here?" He turned the box slowly in his hands. The seams were sealed with lead solder, the kind used in the late 1800s for airtight storage. He tapped the surface. It rang with a muffled, resonant tone. Something inside shifted faintly, just enough to prove it wasn't empty. The air in the chamber seemed to tighten, colder now, pressing in from all sides. Bear had gone still, standing on the rail, with his nose, lifted eyes fixed on the box. Jack could feel the tremor in his own hands, not fear exactly, but reverence. He had opened countless machines in his life, disassembled engines, bombs, and vehicles, each hiding some predictable truth of gears or circuitry. But this felt like he had opened a door into another life. He crouched, setting the box beside his knee. The engraving shimmered faintly in the light, the letters carved by hand rather than machine, the strokes deep enough to outlast a century of silence. A foreman, Jack murmured, thinking of the plate. A man who built things to last. Maybe even things he wanted found. He looked down at Bear, whose tail swept the dust softly behind him. "Someone meant for this to be found," Jack said, voice barely above a whisper. The sound of it echoed once, twice, fading into the cold breath of the mountain that now felt closer than ever, as if listening. The air inside the tunnel was so still that Jack could hear his own pulse. The box sat between him and Bear, its dull steel skin catching the lantern's soft light. Every inch of it was worn, scarred, and deliberate, sealed by hands that had known exactly what they were protecting. Jack brushed his thumb across the engraved letters again. Silver Elk, January 1894, A. Croft. The metal felt colder than the surrounding air, almost unnaturally so. He pulled out his old military knife, its blade nicked and stained from years of service, and wedged it into the thin seam along the lid. Bear lay beside him, head on his paws, eyes glinting with quiet alertness. "All right, partner," Jack whispered. "Let's see what a man from another century thought was worth hiding." He pressed down on the knife. The steel gave a soft groan, a sound like something waking from a long sleep. He moved slowly, scraping along the seam, then lifted the hammer from his pack. The first strike rang through the chamber, echoing off the walls. The second hit loosened the solder flakes of lead tumbling away. The third sent a sharp vibration up the handle. It felt like striking the heartbeat of the mountain itself. Bear's ears flicked back. He gave a low sound, half warning, half encouragement. "Easy, boy," Jack said, taking a breath before hitting one final time. The lid gave way with a crack. Then a sigh, a hiss of displaced air escaping from another era. Jack froze, hand hovering over the edge. The smell that rose from inside wasn't decay or rot, but something faintly metallic and clean, like heated copper and oilcloth. He leaned forward and lifted the lid completely. Light caught the first glint of gold. A single sharp reflection scattered across the dark chamber, warm and alive. For a moment, Jack didn't move. He just stared, trying to make sense of the color, the deep, soft gleam that only one thing in the world could make. Beneath the glow of his lantern, rows of small gold bars lay tightly packed, each one wrapped in old oilskin preserved against time. He reached in with trembling fingers and pulled one free. It was heavier than he expected. The cloth peeled away, revealing a perfect bar, its surface stamped with a seal he knew from his years in Colorado History USSA office, Denver, 1893. The edges were sharp, untouched by oxidation. He turned it in his hand, watching it catch the light. "Good Lord," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Bear whined softly, tail brushing the floor. "We found it," Jack said to him, half in disbelief, half in awe. "It's real." He placed the gold bar beside the box and reached in again. This time his hand brushed against a small drawstring pouch. When he lifted it, the faint rattle inside made his chest tighten. He loosened the string and poured the contents into his palm. Rough, uncut diamonds spilled out, scattering light across the cabin like fractured stars. They sparkled cold against the warm glow of the lantern, untouched by time or hand. Jack stared until his eyes watered, the reflections dancing like ghosts across his vision. Carefully, he returned the gems to the pouch and set it aside. His fingers touched one more object, a small leather book, dark brown edges stiff with age but intact. He lifted it reverently, brushing away the dust. The clasp was rusted, but yielded to a gentle pull. The handwriting inside was elegant but shaky, the ink faded to sepia. The first line read, "Journal of Andrew Croft." Jack swallowed, his throat dry. He turned the page slowly. "I, Andrew Croft, hide what remains of my fortune." The entry began, "Not to be found by thieves, but by someone who remembers that work, not wealth, endures." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that pressed on Jack's chest. He read on, "The mines are lost. The market is gone. Yet I cannot bear to see what we built turn to dust. So I leave behind not just gold, but a record, a hope that someone might remember the hands that forged it. I also set aside a small pouch of uncut stones I received in barter from a wagoner out of Central City when the markets turned payment not in coin, but in trust." The ink trailed off there, replaced by faint indentations, where the pen had paused, as if the man had hesitated before writing the next truth. Jack sat back, eyes glistening under the dim light. He thought of the foreman's mark carved into the steel, "For my son." He imagined a man sealing this very box, hearing the echo of collapsing stone outside, believing this would outlive him. The air felt charged with something greater than discovery, an understanding quiet and profound. Jack looked at Bear. The dog sat completely still, eyes reflecting the soft gold light like twin embers. "Wealth is fleeting," Jack said, voice barely above a whisper. "But what a man builds from the earth that endures." The words from the journal echoed inside him, resonating deeper than any victory or medal he'd ever known. For a long time he didn't move. The lantern flame flickered low, casting slow-moving shadows across the metal walls. The box before him wasn't just treasure, it was a heartbeat preserved in steel and sand, a man's faith buried beneath a century of silence. Jack's reflection shimmered on the gold, his face older, lined with time, but somehow lighter. He placed the lid gently beside the box, resting his hands on his knees. Bear leaned forward, sniffing the open chest, then looked up at Jack as if asking what came next. Jack smiled faintly, a fragile curve of peace crossing his tired face. "What do we do with something like this, boy?" he murmured. But the mountain gave no answer, only the soft hum of stillness and the quiet gleam of gold breathing in the dark. Jack stepped out of the mine just as dawn broke over the ridgeline. The light was thin at first, pale and uncertain, but it grew stronger as it crept down the slopes, touching the trees, the snow, and finally the steel box he carried in both hands. He set it down gently on the frosted ground beside him. The air outside felt sharper, purer after the stale breath of the tunnel, and for a moment he simply stood there letting it fill his lungs. The gold inside the box glowed faintly under the morning sun, soft, alive, the color of fire tamed by time. Bear trotted up beside him, paws sinking into the snow, breath misting in small clouds. Jack sat down heavily, the weight of exhaustion and discovery pressing into his bones. He looked at the box, its shadow stretching across the snow. "We could sell it all," he said quietly, "every last bar." His voice sounded strange small against the vastness of the peaks. He imagined it selling the gold buying land down south, maybe a little shop or garage where no one knew his name, where he could fix old engines and live out his years in peace. It was a thought that should have comforted him. Instead, it felt hollow. Bear moved closer, resting his head on Jack's knee. His eyes were soft, distant, reflecting the sun rising over the snowfields. Jack reached down absently, scratching behind the dog's ear. "You wouldn't care, would you?" he murmured. "Gold means nothing to you." Bear gave a slow sigh, closing his eyes. The sound was simple content, but it struck Jack like a truth too gentle to ignore. The dog wasn't guarding the treasure. He was guarding the man who had found it. Jack leaned back, gazing at the horizon. The wind came down from the ridge cold and clean, carrying with it the faint smell of pine and something metallic like the breath of the mine itself. His mind replayed the words from Croft's journal, every line etched deeper now that he'd seen the man's legacy with his own eyes. "Work, not wealth, endures." He could almost hear Croft's voice, steady and hopeful, echoing through the years. Jack thought of the inscription on the boiler, "For my son," and felt something inside him shift. He had no son, no family. Nothing to pass down except the weight of his own silence. Yet, in that moment, he realized that finding this gold had never been about inheritance. It had been about rediscovery of purpose, of meaning, of the simple act of building again. The wind rose briefly, swirling snow around him like ash. Jack watched it dance and settle the white flakes, landing softly on the steel lid of the box. "We'll build it again," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "For him and for us." Bear opened his eyes, lifting his head slightly as if to acknowledge the promise. Jack smiled faintly. The decision sat in him like a spark, small but alive. He closed the box, pressing the lid shut until it sealed with a dull click. The sound felt final, like a heartbeat finding rhythm again. He rested his hand on it for a moment, feeling the cold seep into his skin, then stood. The sun was fully above the ridge now, flooding the valley in light so bright it almost hurt to look at. The snow around him glittered with the same golden hue as the treasure hidden within the box, and for the first time in years, Jack didn't look away. He picked up the box and began walking toward the truck parked below. Boots crunching through the snow. Bear followed close behind, tail swaying slowly steady as the rhythm of footsteps through time. Jack didn't know what it would take to restore the mine, or how a man like him, a worn-out veteran with too many ghosts, could build something worthy of the name Croft had left behind. But as he walked, he felt something new, not the weight of gold, but the pull of purpose. He had seen enough of war to know that what was built out of greed always fell. What was built out of heart could endure anything. At the truck, Jack paused, setting the box gently in the passenger seat. He leaned against the door, staring back at the mountain. Its slopes were bright now, the snow melting just enough to reveal streaks of gray rock beneath. It looked less like a tomb and more like a beginning. He rubbed his hands together, the ache in his knuckles sharp but alive. "You left it for someone to finish," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to the mountain itself. "All right, Andrew, I'll finish it." Bear barked once, a clear, steady sound that echoed across the empty valley. Jack smiled again, the first real smile he had managed in years, faint and fleeting, but real. "You hear that, Bear?" he said softly. "Guess we've got work to do." The dog wagged his tail once his eyes fixed on the light spreading across the peaks. Together, man and dog stood there a moment longer. Two silhouettes against the rising sun, one carrying the past, the other reminding him of the present. And somewhere, deep within the mountain, behind the stone and silence, It felt as if the air moved again, slow and deliberate like the world itself, exhaling after a long, forgotten breath. Spring came late that year, creeping down from the high ridges in slow, uncertain waves. By the time the last snow melted, the land around Silver Elk was alive again, pine needles glistening with dew, the streams running clear and cold through the valley. Jack stood at the edge of the property with Bear beside him, watching the sunlight hit the entrance of the mine. It no longer looked like a wound in the mountain. It looked like a place that was finally breathing again. He filed notice with the county and worked with the Historical Society to document the find, agreeing in writing that the locomotive and the tunnel chamber would be preserved as industrial heritage rather than exploited for ore. The rest he locked away in a small safety deposit box at the local bank, never mentioning it to anyone. The mine wasn't meant to reopen for profit. It was meant to be reborn. The locals thought he was crazy at first, a middle-aged veteran with a dog and a dream to turn an abandoned mine into a workshop for old soldiers and wanderers. But slowly, curiosity gave way to help. Volunteers arrived, retired mechanics, carpenters, a welder who'd once served in the Navy. They brought tools, ideas, and stories. Jack named it the Silver Elk Heritage Workshop. Its purpose was simple: give veterans a chance to work with their hands again, to build rather than destroy. We're not digging for ore, Jack would say. We're digging for purpose. He used Croft's journal as a guide, borrowing the man's principles of craft and endurance. The first building they raised was a long wooden hall beside the old rail line. The second was a forge. Jack taught basic welding and engine repair. The men and women who came were quiet at first, but soon the sound of hammers and saws filled the valley, steady, rhythmic, healing. Bear became the guardian of the place, padding from one workshop to another, greeting each new arrival with a wag of his tail and a low approving bark. Someone suggested making him the workshop's official mascot, and Jack agreed. A local artist painted Bear's image onto the workshop's new sign, a proud German shepherd standing beside an anvil framed by mountains and rail tracks. It hung above the main gate with the words Silver Elk Heritage Workshop, built to endure. On opening day, the small town gathered to see what Jack had done. Jack and the volunteers rigged a cable hoist from an old Jeep frame and laid temporary panel track from the tunnel mouth to the service road. The town crane took the lift while volunteers spotted the load inching number 42 onto a lowboy trailer under a cold gray dawn. They signed the safety waivers, closed the road for an hour, and the whole town held its breath as the Shay rose out of the dark and into the light. The restored Shay locomotive stood gleaming at the center of the yard, freshly painted black, with brass fixtures polished to a mirror shine. Children climbed the steps to the cab while their parents took photographs. The older veterans stood quietly beside Jack, hands in pockets, their eyes reflecting the same mix of pride and disbelief. Jack spoke briefly, his voice steady but soft. "We didn't just find gold," he said. "We found a way to start again." His words hung in the air, simple and heavy with meaning. People clapped, but Jack barely heard them. He was watching Bear, who sat proudly at the base of the locomotive, ears forward, chest out like a sentinel, carved from light and loyalty. Months passed, and the workshop grew, the clang of hammers mixed with laughter oil and pine thick in the air. Jack often worked late, cleaning tools or polishing the locomotive's frame. It had become a ritual. Each night before heading home, he would run a rag over the brass plate that read, Lima Locomotive Works, Class B Shayno 42, as if to thank the machine for its patience. One evening, while polishing the side of the boiler, he noticed something unusual. Beneath a thin layer of rust, there seemed to be faint etchings, not the factory markings, but something older. He squinted, holding the lantern close. The letters came slowly, one by one, emerging from the iron like whispers from another time. "To whoever finds this, thank you for keeping my promise. A. Croft." Jack froze, the rag still in his hand. His throat tightened, vision blurring. The words weren't part of the original engraving. They had been hidden under layers of rust, perhaps carved by Croft himself before sealing the mine. Jack reached out and traced the letters with a trembling finger. "You did keep it." he said, softly, voice catching in his throat. Bear, sensing the shift in him, padded over and leaned his head against Jack's leg. Jack laughed through the tears that blurred his eyes. Looks like we kept it, Bear. He knelt beside the dog, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. The lantern light flickered against the polished steel, casting their shadows together on the side of the old locomotive man and dog keeper and companion, bound not by gold, but by something far more enduring. That night, the wind moved gently through the valley, carrying the faint hum of laughter and hammering from the workshop. The stars hung low above the mountains, bright and clear, reflecting off the metal of the restored engine. Jack stood outside a long time before locking up one hand, resting on the locomotive's warm steel, the other scratching behind Bear's ear. "We built it again," he whispered. "For him, for us, for all of them." The dog gave a soft sound of agreement, his tail brushing the ground in slow rhythm. The night seemed to breathe with them, a living, endless pulse echoing the promise they had kept. 5 years passed like the slow turning of a wheel, steady and inevitable polishing time into memory. Leadville had changed. The town that once slept under snow and silence now hummed softly with life again. On the first day of spring, sunlight spilled over the square, glinting off the brass and steel of the restored Silver Elk No. 42. The old Shea locomotive stood on a short section of rail in the center of the plaza, its black body gleaming like obsidian against the pale sky. Children ran in circles around it, their laughter bright and echoing between the brick storefronts and new workshops that lined the streets. A small bronze plaque affixed to the side caught the morning light. Silver Elk, built 1890, lost 1894, found 2024, a testament to what endures. Jack sat on a bench nearby, his hands resting on the cane between his knees. The years had carved quiet lines into his face, silver into his hair, but his eyes still carried that same clear blue steadiness, calm as the high mountain sky. Beside him, Bear lay stretched out in the warmth of the sun. The dog's muzzle had turned gray and one eye clouded faintly, yet his posture remained proud, his head held high as if guarding the square itself. His breathing was slow but steady, the rhythm of a life well lived. Jack reached down and stroked the soft fur behind his ears, smiling faintly. "You did, good old boy," he said. Bear thumped his tail once, a small familiar sound that broke through the murmur of the crowd like a heartbeat. The square was full that day. Former students from the Silver Elk Heritage Workshop had come with their families. Some wore work-stained jackets, others clean shirts and ties, but every one of them bore the same emblem, a small patch stitched to their sleeves of a German shepherd standing beside an anvil. They spoke in low voices, laughing, sharing stories. Jack could pick out faces he knew: Sam, the young welder, who had once been too afraid to hold a hammer after the war; Clara, who rebuilt her father's truck and now ran her own garage; and Tom, who still sent postcards every Christmas from wherever his road took him. Every one of them had built something here. Every one of them had endured. Jack watched a little girl break away from the group and run toward the locomotive. She couldn't have been more than 7, her hair tied in 2 braids that bounced as she climbed the steps to the cab. Her small hands pressed against the metal eyes wide. She turned and spotted Jack sitting on the bench. "Mister," she called, her voice bright, "is it real gold?" The question hung in the air for a heartbeat, light and innocent. And then Jack chuckled softly. He tapped his cane on the ground and shook his head. "Yes," he said finally. "It's real, but not in the way you think." The girl frowned, puzzled. Jack smiled, gesturing toward the locomotive. "The gold's not inside the train, sweetheart. It's what we chose to do with it." The girl's eyes widened for a moment. Then she nodded, as if she understood something even adults often forgot. She ran off to join the others, her laughter trailing behind her. Bear shifted beside him, letting out a low, contented sound before resting his head gently on Jack's foot. Jack looked down at him, eyes softening. The sun caught in Bear's fur, turning the silver to fire. "You feel that," Jack murmured. "Spring, warm again." The dog's ear twitched, acknowledging the words in his quiet way. Jack's gaze lifted back to the locomotive, its brass fittings shining in the morning light. and then beyond to the mountains in the distance. The snowcaps glowed under the sun, golden at their edges. Somewhere behind those peaks, hidden beneath stone and silence, the tunnels of Silver Elk still stretched into darkness, carrying the echoes of hammers and the breath of time. He thought of Andrew Croft, the man whose name had haunted the metal, whose words had reshaped his life. Work, not wealth, endures. The sentence lived in him now like a vow. He looked around the square, the rebuilt workshops, the laughter of children, the sound of trains in the distance carrying timber and stone. Everything here had been born from that buried truth. He was right, Mayor Jack said softly. This is what endures. The words felt heavier now, not as a discovery, but as acceptance. A breeze carried the scent of pine and oil as flags fluttered, and a distant hammer rang like the town's heartbeat. Jack closed his eyes, listening. Bear's breathing matched the rhythm perfectly. For a long while they stayed that way, man and dog, two silhouettes carved in morning light, surrounded by the quiet miracle of what they had helped build. When Jack opened his eyes again, he saw a reflection of himself and Bear shimmering faintly in the polished steel of the engine. Two figures, one sitting tall, one lying faithful at his feet, guardians of a promise that had crossed a century. The train gleamed like it was alive again, its brass glinting like the first dawn. Jack reached out and patted Bear's side. "We did it, partner," he whispered. "We found our way home." The dog gave a low sigh, a sound full of peace. The bell on the locomotive swayed gently in the breeze, letting out a soft hollow note, a sound like a prayer fading into the bright mountain air. People paused to listen, and for a heartbeat the entire square fell still. In that stillness there was no gold, no war, no loss, only the echo of hands that had built hearts that had endured, and the quiet truth that some legacies are measured not in what they find, but in what they choose to build after. If this story touched you, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps us keep bringing these true human stories to life. What part of Jack and Bear's journey moved you the most? Tell us in the comments and let us know where you're watching from.